hear the talk this morning. So looks like a lot of interesting talks and sessions. Lucky all of you, but really glad to be here today. I want to talk to you about some of our work. As Vanessa mentioned, we do a lot of work in the space of kind of modeling, data synthesis, trying to answer questions about wetlands and how they interact with human societies. Vanessa, is it okay if I kind of make it interactive and ask questions throughout? Okay. So forget about the last second half of that. One other thing before I start. I'm one of the most ill-prepared parks ever because it was like last night, families around, I wasn't. So I'll just talk through stuff. So the main thing I want to be focused on is this idea of wetlandscapes, and I wanted to kind of draw this idea throughout, the idea of landscapes where you have many wetlands and what that means. Let me start a little bit, since I talked about family, let me start a little bit with the first wetland I fell in love with as an undergraduate student in an engineering college in the city of Kolkata. And this is called the Kolkata Wetlands. It has actually now gotten a Ramsar designation. It is this system of, so the city of Kolkata is on the eastern coast of India, and some of you may have heard of the region called Sundarbans, which is the deltaic region. So Kolkata sits just on there, and there's a ton of flooding. So we grew up as kids, every monsoon, there would be days where school would be off or you would be knee deep in water walking to school. The wetlands, these wetland complexes actually protect the city quite a bit from cleaning the sewage generated by the city, because there's not a lot of conventional wastewater treatment plants. As well as holding on to some of the flood water. And the reason I got fascinated when I was doing undergraduate project on it is it's this real synergistic system where you have the waste from the city that leads to a pretty thriving aquaculture systems. There's migratory birds there, just a really beautiful thriving system where you have both water purification as well as livelihood of many people. And these wetlands, of course, a lot of them have been lost now because in a city like Kolkata, developmental pressures are massive. So what I like in that image over there is the high rises and the wetland complexes right beside. And that kind of is runs through the thread of my love for wetlands, wetlands that are in what we call now as working landscapes, urban areas, agricultural areas that are embedded within the landscape that we live in, and how they work in this space of coupled natural and human systems. So moving all the way from India to US, I'll talk to you about some of my work on wetlands. But before we go into that, I just wanted to get a little bit of a pulse of the room in terms of what you think wetlands do for us. What are wetlands? Let's start there. Sorry, I don't know the backgrounds of the people, so I wanted to make a little bit of a deeper dive into thinking about what they are before we talk about.
Was it
yes,
standing water throughout the year?
Yes, good point. Standing water throughout the year. Yes, most of the times when we think of wetlands, we think of standing water throughout the year. But there are these small ephemeral wetlands that I will talk to that have water parts of the year too. But yeah, standing water, and it's a place where the surface and the groundwater connect, right? And they can be a whole lot of different sizes, different functions. In terms of what wetlands do for us, I said the first thing, which was water purification. I gave that as an example. Anybody else, other things that wetlands do for us?
It's taking the greenhouse gas exchange.
Greenhouse gas exchange, right? So do they emit greenhouse gases, or do they?
It's not clear. Certainly, Rebecca Rooney, my colleague, I'm speaking for her. She couldn't be here today. Certainly in Maria's track, they can be carbon sinks in many cases, but the newer stormwater engineered ponds could be carbon sources and even methane sources. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yay, Rebecca and Maria. Thank you.
Then you know exactly, right? So they can be carbon sinks because there's a huge amount of vegetation there, but there's this ongoing debate whether they are net sinks or what net sources, at what time scale do they change from sinks to sources, those layers of questions. But generally you can say that they are they sequester carbon. Anything else? Yes.
Can you say something bad about it?
Absolutely.
No, I was wondering in at least tropical areas, would that be a big mosquito breeding ground and everything?
No, and this is the thing, right? Thanks so much for that, Panu. It's important to think about the good and the bad, right? Because when they are right in the middle of our landscape, the good and the bad both matter. So when I look at my son calls the stinky pond in our neighborhood a stinky pond. And I was having this conversation with a neighbor and I made the point that the reason it's stinky is because it's cleaning your waters. But that is one of the reasons they get lost also very fast from developmental pressures because they are a nuisance or they can be a nuisance. Yes.
Source of biological diversity.
Yes, right. So biological diversity is a big thing about wetlands.
Flood mitigation.
See that?
Flood mitigation.
Yes, yes. So flood mitigation, and I'll add one other to that, groundwater recharge. So there's pots that are sitting there, and if the soil's right, they can recharge our groundwater. Yes.
In certain places, can they be used like pumped storage reservoir?
Yes, so they are used. So there are constructed wetlands that really are just treatment wetlands. Definitely.
I don't know, even for hydropower, if you have two wetlands at different, different heights, you can produce power.
Oh, I haven't ever seen that happen, but maybe it's possible. Okay, so with that, so they do a whole bunch of things from us, but it's not all good. There's also things that you have to think about. And people have studied wetlands for a really long time. The kind of space of research questions that we are interested in as a group is this idea of wetlandscape. So that's kind of a wetlandscape. It's not just one wetland. It's a landscape that is made up of many wetlands. And these wetlands are all different. They can be different landscape positions. They can be of different sizes. They can be of different types. And I'm not a wetland specialist, but I'm giving a talk on wetlands. So I cannot go into all the detail from bobslands and swamps with you, Rebecca, Rooney, or other people that are much better at it, and I won't even try, but there's many kinds of wetlands. And when we started looking into it, one of the things we found is that while a lot of people are specialists on individual wetland types or functions, there was a lack of work on looking at it at the landscape scale, thinking about how different wetlands intersect and interact with one another. That is kind of a group of people started calling these as wetlandscapes. So we wanted to ask the questions, how do wetlandscapes look? How have humans altered them? How have these alterations impacted the services that they provide? And can we do restoration that maximizes or some of these services? So before I go into the questions, I also wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what the path towards these questions in a nutshell. So this is my early career as a professor at University of Iowa in the US. And I did not work on wetlands. So despite my first love for wetlands in my undergraduate, I moved away to work on other stuff. I was working on nutrient pollution and Gulf of Mexico hypoxia. So in Iowa, there's the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and I was having a conversation with someone there, and they said, well, there's been a flood in Iowa, and we've gotten all this money, and the money is for restoring wetlands for flood mitigation. But Iowa is also really known for nutrient pollution. Where can I restore these wetlands? Which wetlands should I restore for maximum nutrient pollution benefit? And I realized I had no idea. I could develop a model or something like that and spend a bunch of money, but I had no idea conceptually if I had to, if wetland restoration had to be done, where. And so this is what made kind of led to this question of thinking, well, how did the landscape look like before it got drained? So just as to give you a little bit of an idea of Iowa, which is the next slide. Yes, exactly. So this is the part of the world that I'm talking about. So this is North America. This is the Des Moines, this is Iowa, this is the Des Moines Lobe in Iowa. So these are landscapes that are depressional landscape. They have been formed during glaciation. So there are these potholes in the landscape. And these potholes have been drained for agriculture. So this is called the prairie pothole region. Canada has one of the largest parts of the prairie pothole region. The end lobe of it is the Des Moines lobe, which is one of the most drained systems of the prairie pothole region. And if you look at the image over here, that's what it looks like. It's these potholes in the ground. And before they were all filled with water. For agriculture, what was done was put these drains called hill drains. These are subsurface pipe right under those potholes, so that takes the water out and you can use it for agriculture. Of course, wetland soils are very carbon rich. So when you are using that land for agriculture, you get very productive agriculture. Over 90% of the wetlands in Iowa are drained. I don't have the image right now, but I found this really cool book where people would talk about how before wetland drainage, that is so big before like mid 1850s or so, people could go from one village to another by ice skating because all of the ponds were connected to each other. And now most of it is drained for agriculture. So that's that. So these are tidal waves where if you have not seen them, it's and they're perforated. So what happens is you have a perforated pipe that is going to depth, water level falls to that depth. And so the rest of the soil is dry. And of course, crops need a drier soil to survive. So that's the reason for draining them. If you look, this is a ditch, and that's the tile that's being added into the ditch section. That's what you see over here. This is the tile that comes out. This is a picture about people laying tile drains under the surface. The interesting things about tile drains is that nobody knows where they are, but they're mostly everywhere because it's done on a case-by-case basis. So as I said, my first question in that space was, how did this landscape look like, right? It has been known that most of the wetlands have been drained, but our question was more about the structure of the landscape and how did that structure change by human settlement. So interestingly, at that time, now LiDAR data is much more common. So LiDAR gives you the elevation levels of the landscape at a very fine scale. At that time, again, Iowa had these major floods, which made this 1 meter LiDAR data available to us. So what we did is use that LiDAR data to answer 2 questions: to better understanding of the size, distribution, and spatial organization of these wetlands, and to ask how did humans change that habit? Okay, I'm going to pause for a second to see if anybody has any questions. Okay, so moving on. So the way we went about it is we used LiDAR to identify depressional wetlands, and then we overlaid that with soil survey. So when you have wetlands, that soil is hydric soil. So you can see that signature in the soil. So this is what you see over here. These are LiDAR identified wetlands. And then we also looked at to see where there was hydric soil. There is a national wetlands inventory. So we overlaid the national wetlands inventory, which gives you current wetland. So the idea is if there's depressions in the ground, and if the soil is hydric, then that was a historical. Of course, there's some assumptions in there, right? Because there's sedimentation that could happen, so there's that. So there's a set of assumptions in there, but we still wanted to see if the LiDAR combined with the soil survey was able to identify the historical wetlands. So that's what we're seeing over there. The pink is different kind of soil, the green is the hydric soil, so that's where the depressions were. And overall, the first thing that we saw is that we had an overall 90% decrease in wetland area. This is the historical wetland density, that's the current wetland density. Of course, that's not unknown. People have talked about a huge loss of wetland density in this region. What we found is really interesting in our study is, again, thinking about how the size distribution has changed. So what you see over here on the x-axis is surface area of depressions, and on the y-axis is number of depressions. Now, you see a par law relationships. Now, par laws are really common. Of course, there's controversies about fitting par laws that I will not get into, but par laws are common in a lot of landscape formations, right? So in this case, the historical wetlands also followed, we found it to follow a typical par law distribution. And then if you plot it on top of a current wetlands, that was still a parallel. What's really unusual here is this yellow piece over there. And this is this idea that while overall there has been a wetland loss, there has been a preferential loss of smaller wetlands in the landscape. Now, let's take a pause and think about it, right? So if you think about it, you realize it makes sense. Again, this goes back to the fact, what do you think is a wetland? We think a wetland is a bigger water body that has water throughout the year and has vegetation, not like the lake, but has vegetation in it, but generally has water all over the year. So when we try to protect wetlands, those are the ones that we want to protect. If you have a water body that has water for 4 months of the year, your tendency or your desire to drain it for agriculture don't really see it as a wetland message. And also it's easier, right? You put a tile drain underneath it and drain it really easy. So and this since that war, other setbacks, the little cabinets, when I moved to Canada, I had a lot of meetings with CRCA where they said it was the same thing, that we had the smaller wetlands, those were the ones that we could not. CRCA is probably the conservation authority where land. And it came coming back, it's like the bigger ones, yes, we can protect, they are provisions in wetlands, but the smaller ones are the ones that we're always fighting because they didn't get into it. And so if you take all of that, and even though that looks like a tiny yellow triangle, keep in mind that's lost, right? So that's a lot of preferential loss, yes.
Sir, I mean, it's kind of hard to believe that 90% could have been lost. Sort of being skeptical.
Yeah.
How is it because of certain time window you take?
90% has been lost.
Yeah.
So this is theoretically making the claim from the start of 7, right? Because this landscape was really just these wetlands connected to each other. It was primarily a wetland landscape. It's kind of depressions in the surface, and they are connected to each other, right? So it's kind of well known that it's mostly has been mostly drained. Right, and so it's starting 1800s or so. So the LiDAR theoretically is identical. That 90% number is actually others have done other kinds of analysis, and they do come up with numbers that I think very similar to that.
How small is small on this?
How small is small? So that is this is hold on. I think so that is 1,000 meters square, so 0.1 hectare. So pretty small.
Yeah.
We talked about any small, I mean, yeah, really small.
No, it's interesting. Also, in southern Ontario, over 90% of the forests have been lost.
Yeah.
Just to put it in perspective.
We have those.
We've lost a lot of natural landscape and have a very populated area.
So since then, others also have, and I don't have that slide here, looked at it in other landscapes, and you see the parallel relationship and this preferential loss of smaller wetlands in a lot of places. And why is this important? And this is where it becomes really interesting. And this, I should have had there is the reference of the paper. So the idea is, and this is pure geometry, you take a small water and you think about groundwater recharge. A small water body has more surface compared to water body. So proportionately, a small water body will actually have greater rate of groundwater recharge compared to a larger water body. So you're losing a groundwater recharge when you're losing a small wetland because of that limited area ratio that you can look into. So this is just showing that with wetlands, your stream flow is buffered and you have like this nice base flow. Without wetlands, that base flow goes away, you get these rain events and it just goes all into the stream. So there is an effect on the stream hydrology and more flooding, so higher peaks. Base flow is cut off. There's also an effect of less groundwater recharge because smaller wetlands preferentially have greater recharge for groundwater.
Can I ask a quick question? Does that also mean higher nutrient loadings into the stream network?
So yes, overall loss of wetlands would be higher nutrientability, but with the water quality piece, that's the piece we delved into it because that was exactly our question.
Oh,
And
okay.
so that's how I'll go into it.
Great.
But yes. So I'll go into that function part a little bit, but I just wanted to show you some other pieces, which I haven't talked in a long time. About the geometry in that we talked about in that paper that I thought was interesting. So it's just not size. It's also the geometry. So I want all of you to look at this. These circles are the current wetlands, the triangles are the historical, and the dashed line is the perimeter area ratio of a circle for comparison. Right? So what is happening to the wetland geometry? So generally, right, if you forget about what is happening, what we are seeing is that smaller water bodies, so on the left-hand side, have higher perimeter to area ratio. So the perimeter versus area, and that's just pure geometry. The dashed line is a circle. If you just derive that relationship for a circle, that's the perimeter to area ratio.
Is connected? Can we connected?
So good question. Yes, we are connected at the same. In this case, we will not. I'm looking at connections with all. We're just looking at the individual parts, individual. You have your own.
I was gonna say like, it becomes more circular.
They are becoming more circular, right? So I wanted to show you a LiDAR image to show that. So this is the LiDAR, which is the historical wetland, right? So outline, the peak outlines are the historical wetland. It's just one snapshot. So then we overlaid on it the current wetlands. So that's the current wetland for that historical. So what you see over there is the geometry of its edges. So on one hand, we've lost all the other pink areas, but even with the one that we remain, its surrounding geometry has become much more simple. And you take why? Yes.
Just the desire for order in built community infrastructure.
Good, good. So exactly that. Farmers right step tractor around it. They don't want that from a tractor. They want more uniform geometry, right? So overall, and that's what happened that we talked about is that the geometry became more circular and simpler, right? And that also has really important kind of meaning for biological chemistry because the complexity of the perimeter is really important from an ecological perspective. And we are losing that complexity of the perimeter. Another way of thinking about it is something called a shoreline irregularity index. So the idea is it's the ratio of the wetland perimeter to the perimeter of a circle of equal area. So greater the shoreline irregularity. So here what you see is that the current wetlands, you have much higher, the historical wetlands had a range of irregularity indices, right? Whereas the current wetlands have a much lower irregularity index and very homogeneous. So this is what humans do to the landscape. They are making, most of them have a really smaller and more constrained irregularity index. Like you said, you want order in our landscape versus previously you had a whole range of irregularity. We are not still talking about connectivity of wetlands, it's individually looking at it across the landscape. Okay, questions? Okay. So what happens in this landscape, there's a couple of different things, right? One is if there is a wetland. So if you look over here, so these were all wetlands, right? And this is just an aerial imagery. So if this is a wetland, if you want to grow crops here, so you can have it under it and rain, so that doesn't hold water. So whenever it's still a depression in the ground, but when it rains, it just rains. Right, that one. So in this one, we decided that we keep it, whoever was there. So they didn't bring it, but we had to move my tractor around it. So let's make it simpler and drain it enough, right? So that it looks more like that. Because it's easier to draw my tractor around it.
So it's the fact that they are becoming smaller or they are becoming more circular, they are in fact almost.
Little bit of both. In this case, we're talking about the fact that they are becoming, their complexity of their edges are going away.
Okay,
They're becoming, the edges are becoming simple.
so the ages have impact on body ages.
It can, and I'm not ready, but generally we know, I mean, I don't come from that background, people here do. That as you lose the complexity of the edges, it has impacts for a whole range of things. Yes.
So, shape matters clearly, but is it fair to say that the volume is more important than the shape? If you have a huge volume, whether it's circular or oval, does it matter as much?
So I asked the question mathematically, right? So if my goal is protect against flood, then I want as big a pot as possible, as big a volume as possible, don't care about anything. If my goal is other functions, the volume might matter less than the shape or other things, right? So it depends on the function. So for example, the thing that I understand in terms of kind of biochemistry at the edges and some nutrient purification, the complexity of the edge matters because your diversity of, so one of the things, without going into a lot of details, is that these things called redox interfaces, which is where there's such saturated and unsaturated zones merge. So the more complex you have the edges, the more you get those zones where you have pores filled with water and pores that have air in it. And reaction rates are much higher at those interfaces. So these are called redox interfaces because of that oxic and oxic interface. So the complexity of the edges.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yes, that's.
Just following on that last thing you said, I think I'll maybe think again about analog, right, like organs, right, like for instance, like the fact that like our lungs are they're not like uniformly shaped, right, you have that complex structure for the timing, so that you have more of that kind of surface area for more of the exchanges.
That's very absolutely. So nature, like whether it's inside our bodies or outside, has complexity and complexity there for a reason. That was a yes.
Again, being an engineer, so maybe make a stupid question or biologist, but can we increase, but given surface area, can we redesign the pond to increase the perimeter or contact?
Absolutely, I mean, if you think about in the world of stream, right, when people talk about kind of stream, floodplain reconnection, that's what we do.
And also like, for example, you can do like a star like thing, which has much more perimeter than
Yes,
say that one. Will that be
But then,
better?
there's like a function piece of play. If I'm a farmer, would I want them to do that? Because I think it's harder for me to do my tractor run.
No, yeah, again, the
So that-
objectives, yeah.
No, I mean, this is the key, right? This is thinking about these wetlands in these national, in these working landscapes. It's not, it's kind of this trade-off about which part you can manipulate and which part you have to let go and say this is good enough. Okay, so again, this is not my area, but people have shown that as you decrease perimeter area ratio, your biodiversity goes down. So perimeter area ratio is a really important factor for thinking about biodiversity. Okay, so this is the other thing, and again, I haven't presented this stuff in a long time. This is a repeat. So the other thing we looked at is how, so till now, if you think about these different pieces of this puzzle, right? The first piece we talked about is like just individual wetlands, right? Not thinking about anything. Now we're saying how far or near are the wetlands from each other? So NN is nearest neighbor distance. So now we take each wetland and say, well, what are the neighboring wetlands and what is the distance to the neighboring wetlands, right? And what we plot for each wetland is that nearest neighbor distance. So again, can someone look at it and tell me what that appears, what has happened in their space? So the triangles are historical and the circles are current.
I'm either exactly wrong or exactly right, but large wetlands are more disconnected.
Large wetlands are more disconnected,
Okay.
yes, the nearest neighbor distance is right here. Absolutely, and the thing that I like about this kind of relationship is if you look at the historical, you see again this horror kind of behavior, and that's a landscape formation feature. But then if you look at the current wetlands. So if you look at the larger ones, they're kind of similar, we are as disconnected as before. But the current ones are farther apart than they have been. Right, so the nearest neighbor distances between any one of the larger ones is not going to change that much. The nearest neighbor distances for the smaller wetlands have decreased. Right? So in essence, what we are saying is smaller wetlands that are remaining are further apart. Right? And that has a huge role to play from a biological dispersal effect, right? Because there's organisms that move from one wetland to another, different stages of their life cycle. So if they are further apart and disconnected in the physical space, then that connection is lost. So even the smaller ones retained are not very long in the functions.
Excuse me, Nandita.
Yes.
We're just having a bit of a network issue with our audio and video. It would help the Zoom participants if you could actually stay closer to the audio for the rest of the talk, as they're not able to get to the full audio right now. We'll work on that.
No worries. Okay. So any questions with that? Yes.
Well, it looks like for the larger ones that they're become more sporadic, it's deviating from this parallel line that they're up and down rather than along the line that they want.
I would say that is also kind of what humans do to the landscape idea, because I think the larger ones now, the ones that are remaining it becomes more like, so the power law comes from the landscape structure, right? And so the modification means that we've left a wetland there, but we drained the wetland here, right? So there's a little bit of an erraticness to it, and I think that's the reason it goes up and down a lot. Of course, keep in mind that when you look at the smaller ones, you're talking about a much larger number of wetlands in the system, right? When you look at the larger surface area of the depressions, your sample sizes are also low.
They're so clustered for the historical around this curve.
Yeah.
It's really changed.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, moving on. So the other thing that we looked at was distance to the river network. And again, the circles are the current and the triangles are the historic. Right, so what you see over here is that you're using a lot more of the historical wetlands. So you're using a lot more of the upland wetlands, and the distance to the river network has increased. Okay, moving on. So this was the first bit of our work where we were kind of looking at what has changed in the landscape. Then we went on to think about from that space to think about, well, what does that mean in terms of wetland functioning? And any of these things that we talked about could be translated to wetland functioning. And we have ideas to do some of them, but for now, the only thing we looked at was size. And here we ask the question, so this is work done by Fred Chang, who came to do a master's degree and is now starting a position at University of Virginia as an assistant professor soon. So Fred started this work where we just asked a simple question. What is the role of wetland size in nutrient removal? And what are the implications for nutrient removal potential of wetlandscapes? So we started out with a meta-analysis. So Fred looked at data from hundreds of wetlands around. We also looked at reservoirs and lakes, and we collected data from approximately 600 water bodies with respect to nitrogen and phosphorus. I won't go into a lot of the details of the work, but basically what we found is smaller wetlands have faster denitrification kinetics rate constant than larger wetlands. And this type of work has been, is known for the world of small streams versus large rivers, that small streams have per unit area faster removal rates than larger rivers. And again, the idea comes from the fact that when you have more sediment is where a lot of the biogeochemical transformation happens. So if you just do geometry, you have a small water body, which has a large sediment area, small water volume, and if you have a large water body, that ratio is what creates that. And I don't have that slide over here, but in this paper, what we did is we developed a really simple model where we had the wetland water, and it was two differential equation, one for reactions within the water column, one for reactions within the sediment, and we kept everything else the same and just changed the geometry. And we saw that just changing the geometry, you could estimate, you could get that kind of effective rate constant at the scale of the wetlands, where a small wetland was removing more nutrients than a larger wetland. So what do I mean by that when I say small? So people ask when we say this is, so does it mean that total mass removal will be more in a small versus large? So Brendan made the slide, which I was going to see. So the x-axis is fractional wetland area lost. And on the y-axis is fractional nitrogen removal potential loss. So let's say you have a scenario where we are losing the small wetlands first. What we'll end up saying is that if you lose 50% of the wetland area, you're losing over 80% of the nitrogen removal potential of the landscape. Now, if you do the same, but you lose the larger wetlands first, in that case, when you lose 50%, you lose a much smaller potential of nitrogen removal potential. Or in other words, 10 1-hectare wetlands remove more nutrients than 1 10-hectare wetland. Right, so this kind of this idea that these small water bodies have a disproportionately large effect, and those 10 1-hectare wetlands get destroyed much faster than that 1 10-hectare wetland. Yes.
So Sarah Birch gave a lecture yesterday. She was primarily focused on climate change. She flashed the planetary boundary picture on the screen. And again, as somebody who didn't know working about wetlands, and she also said this, often when we see that we're exceeding our planetary boundary for nitrogen and phosphorus, a common conclusion is that we are using too much fertilizer. But I'm taking from your talk that we are also destroying the natural things that would actually help us with that planetary boundary.
Absolutely. So that's one of the things that is really, really important to think about. It actually, that question came up in this recent interview on KW radio, and the point being, like, this is really relevant right now here because we are losing our wetlands because of pressures of land. Housing prices are exorbitant, and the question that often comes is, well, we have unaffordable housing now, so we need to lose the wetlands for that. And my point to that is, it's like a double whammy that we are doing to the landscape, because on one hand, you're increasing the populations, or increasing the pollution, and then losing the wetlands, which are filtering that water.
Just in case anybody doesn't know, the
Oh, yes.
arguments of the province that opening those lands for housing will decrease affordability are absolutely false. There's no scarcity of developable land. Everybody in the housing industry knows that. Just want to make sure you know too, that it's being done for no benefit related to affordable housing. Sorry,
Yeah.
just so everybody knows.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. I do not come from that background, so I will tell that. I mean, to me, it's different for a different reason, because you're increasing the pollution, but yeah.
It's
but then-
stupid for so many reasons.
Yeah.
But it's also not going to accomplish its stated goal. Yeah, thank you.
Others questions? Okay. This is an interesting talk for me because I actually prepared this so fast, I don't even know what the next slide is. Okay, what's okay. So, okay, I did not know this was coming, but this is also so a few years ago, I was a part of this group. This is Powell Center Group. So some of you might or might not know, in the US, the US Geological Survey does these working groups where you meet in Fort Collins, Colorado, a couple of times a year and talk about an issue that requires a lot of kind of synthesis, and it should be a topical issue. And in this case, our questions was about these wetlands that are called geographically isolated wetlands. And there's a huge world of controversies about the term even. The reason is previously they used to be called isolated wetlands. Some people call them upland wetlands. The main idea is wetlands that don't have a visible connection to your river or stream downstream, right? So these are not riparian wetlands. But then the question is a wetland really isolated? How do you know it's isolated? There might be a subsurface connection. So then people started saying, well, let's call them geographically isolated wetlands. Does that help? Anyway, the point being that they need to, so in this paper, we talked about the fact that they need to become an integral part of how we make decisions on the landscape, where should we restore wetland, and what kind of restoration targets help in addressing pollution. Okay, any questions on any of this before we move forward? Yes.
Just on the bottom of your slide about where wetland restoration should be prioritized, is there like a rule that you would follow on that?
So we're still, I would say we're still in the process of answering that question. We've done a little bit of it in the space of just thinking about water purification, and I'll present that in a bit. But part of the challenge is that question is a function of what your goal is, right? So if flood mitigation is my goal, for example, a lot of times more the large water body that's downstream, most downstream of my watershed might be the wetland that I would want to preserve. If water purification, maybe it's another wetland. If biodiversity, maybe it's another wetland, right? But at this point, I think we even don't know at a landscape scale which ones to restore for what benefit. I think once we have all those layers, we can get to understanding like locally what kinds of prioritization you would do. So we're going there, moving towards that, but other questions? Yes.
I have a very general question about the prediction of the 50 years or something like that. Because I'm talking about that I grew up in a very countryside, in the Indian subcontinent. I'm from Bangladesh. And my childhood was like that. We have like lots of wetland, like ponds and other things. So I visited my country last year and my village, and I went there. I did not see any pond there. Everything is like now houses and everything. And there is no flooding. It was regular flood in our country. I used to go to school like a swimming, and none of this. So I'm wondering that, do you think that after 50 or 100 years, that whole world will be like a desert or something like that?
Hopefully not. That's the point.
There is no wetland anymore. I mean, I can say 95% is lost.
Yeah, we are losing wetlands.
Or rivers. We had a river there. It was always like full of current and everything. Now it's like totally stagnant.
Yeah, we have been losing. I mean, I just saw the other day that Cape Town has now kind of completely said that it's day zero,
Yes.
right? So I do think, and I grew up in Kolkata, growing up, I don't think growing up in India, we really understood the water scarcity effect as much. I still remember having a conversation with my mom, and she's saying, well, there's been some problem with water. Let's just start a deeper well now. And it's just not there. But some cities in India have been seeing real water scarcity issues. And I think in the next decade, we are going to see a lot more of it, unfortunately. But hopefully not. I don't think we can survive that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so then we wanted to kind of ask the question, and this kind of also, a lot of my research have been driven by kind of general conversations with people. So this one was a general conversation with a colleague who said, okay, wetlands are good, but how much nitrogen is removed by wetlands anyway? And again, I realized I had no idea. So we went about a path of looking at the data sets we had to answer this question at an American Geophysical Union meeting in San Francisco. So this is students in the lab and sitting around a coffee shop thinking about how to answer this question across at the continental scale. So the way we went about it is there's the National Wetland Inventory data set in the US. There's a parallel Canadian wetland inventory too, which we are working on now. And we have spatial data for 20 million wetlands in the National Wetland Inventory. So we had access to that data. And we used the meta-analysis that I just described to develop empirical relationship between size of the wetlands and its nutrient removal potential. And then I'm going to skip through this part, and we ended up with what is the percent of wetland removal, but nitrogen removal by wetland in each watershed across the US. And of course, if you look at that map, the purple areas are areas where you have high wetland density. That corresponds to high nitrogen removal, high wetland density, right? What you're seeing over here is really obvious. In more wetlands, there's more nitrogen removal potential because they are removed by these wetlands. But just because there is potential doesn't mean it will be removed. And this is where we need to think about connecting sources with things. So another part of our work, which has been one of the older pieces that I've been working on for a long time, is to develop these nitrogen phosphorus budgets on these landscapes. So this involves a lot of cow counting, a lot of looking at census databases, trying to make sense of it, taking all those and developing these nitrogen input and output maps across the country. Also, we are currently doing this in Canada too. So what you see over here is nitrogen surplus. So this is the net nitrogen input. So this is nitrogen coming in as fertilizer, manure, minus crops being taking out nitrogen from the landscape. So the red areas are high nitrogen input areas. Now, then you can take that is the input. The percent that I showed is the nitrogen removal potential. Take all of that together and answer the question, how much nitrogen is removed? So the purple colors are the intensity of nitrogen removal across the country. What you see over here is that it's a little bit of a mix. A lot of nitrogen is removed in the Mississippi Basin because there is a lot of nitrogen being produced there. And now what does 0.86 teragram mean? It means that without existing wetlands, nitrogen loads in the Mississippi River Basin would be about 50% higher than the Earth. And that is what I see the value of some of our work. It's not that it's an exact number or there's uncertainty in it, but generally, while we know that wetlands are a great thing, this is telling you that while we're trying to reduce nitrogen loads to the Gulf of Mexico because it causes hypoxia, what we're seeing over here that if we lost the current wetlands, even though there's very few wetlands remaining, the nitrogen loads will down. Okay, so the other piece of it is this is an older slide. Okay. So what you see over here, we ask the question, where are the wetlands and where is the excess nitrogen? So what you see over here is these yellow areas where there's a ton of wetlands, but not that much nitrogen. The red areas where you have a ton of nitrogen that's coming in, but not that many wetlands. So in terms of prioritization for restoration, you want to prioritize those areas in the landscape. So that's the slide I was expecting. So the red areas is where you want to prioritize wetland restoration. So we started this process where we asked the question, how can wetland restoration lead to improvements in water quality? And again, this was simulation. So what we said is, let's imagine we are restoring wetlands across the entire country, of course, not in the middle of the desert on top of the mountains. We have some caveats that we removed them. And we had these are small wetlands. So just to give you an idea of when I'm talking about wetland, restoring wetland, it's a farmer's farm field and it's a small pond inside this farm field. So we're not really talking about changing entire landscape. It's small pots of water inside within an agricultural landscape where maybe the crop productivity is low because it's a low spot. So we asked the question, how can wetland restoration lead to improvement in water quality? So we used our nitrogen surplus and the land cover database, and we first simulated random placement of wetlands in the landscape. So here we are randomly placing wetlands everywhere in the landscape. We say if we add 10% wetland area, how will it look like? And that's what it looks like. It's all over the country. This one is all over the country still, but no agricultural land loss. So we made the point, farmers don't want any agricultural land loss, so we are going to put it only on non-ag land. And the third is where we are targeting wetland placement in areas where nitrogen inputs are the maximum. So you see blue areas now, the hotspots. So targeted things coming up. And we calculated nitrogen removal for all of them. So what you see in this image over here on the x-axis is increase in wetland area. Y-axis is increase in nitrogen removal. The three lines are for the top one, it's targeted, this one is random, and this one is no agricultural land loss. So the first thing we see was that the targeted wetland restoration can reduce 40 times more nitrogen, especially when you're trying to be at the lower range of areas than non-targeted loss. Of course, we can argue that it comes at an extra cost because you're taking agriculture, prime farm field and adding wetlands there. So we did take into account that because leasing costs of land that are agricultural are higher. But the cost was only double. So now you see the same figure with annual cost on the y-axis. Cost was only double the cost of non-targeted restoration. And what was really interesting for us is that the cost we came up with was not much higher compared to money that is spent in US on various agricultural nutrient reduction programs. So the main point that I think I'd like to make is that a lot of times we talk about not enough money, but sometimes the fund is there, but it's used in a very diffuse way. I'll tell you an anecdotal story. So this is when I was in Iowa, and I was attending this kind of council meeting about nutrient reduction. And there was this conversation about riparian buffers. They were installing riparian buffers, a lot of riparian buffers. It was pretty expensive, but nitrogen concentrations in soils were not really changing. So there was a lot of debate about what use of that. And of course, riparian buffers have a lot of many benefits, but this land is drained by tidal waves. So the tidals were coming below the buffers right into your ditch. So riparian buffers shouldn't do it. So these riparian buffers to reduce nitrogen pollution. And that's part of the thing that I think with the way we do our agricultural management for any target is that it's not non-targeted. So in this case, the targeted restoration is what was really important to think about.
Can I ask a quick question there?
Yes.
I'm not up on US agricultural policy. Does the conservation reserve program still exist, and does it have particular benefits for preservation or creation of ag wetlands?
So there's two programs that exist. The conservation reserve program exists, and there's also a wetland reserve program.
Okay.
The interesting, which I will talk about, fun thing about that is that those programs are undersubscribed. So there's other layers to what it takes to restore wetlands on farmers' field, and it's not just the wetlands. But yeah. And also this is relevant right now in both US and Canadian landscape where a lot of money is pouring in to do all of this for climate benefits. So one of the main takeaways from there, of course, is without existing wetlands, nitrogen loads would be 50% higher, but also that a targeted 22% increase in wetland area could result in a 40% decrease in nitrogen loads, bringing us again closer to the targets for the Gulf of Mexico. So it is possible to address some of these goals, but targeting is really, really key, is the main message in this space. Okay. I'm trying to think how much of this I will go into. I'll talk about one thing over here, but I said 10:20 is the end of the session, right? So I don't think I want to go into too much and here I'm going to jump through a few slides. I'm just going to bring in one last idea in this space without going into the details of the farming effort. So Till now, we are talking of the structure and targeting. The other aspect that is really important to think about is this idea of connectivity of these systems. So in the US, there is a huge controversy that came about in terms of thinking about this idea of significant nexus. So wetlands would be protected as long as you could argue that they have a significant nexus to downstream waters. That's when they are under the jurisdiction of Clean Water Act. When they have a significant nexus to navigable waters. So a lot of the isolated wetlands or potentially isolated wetlands get lost because you cannot prove that there is a nexus to downstream waters. And there's been a huge body of work, and I've been heard of some of that says, well, maybe even if there's a surface connection, maybe there's a subsurface connection, how do you know it's a connection or not, right? And it's not to prove it. What we wanted to think about in this space is turning the idea on its head and see why for a connection, this connectivity matters. And I won't go into the mathematical modeling on this, but the main idea is as follows. If you have a small water body in the landscape that is disconnected to the downstream waters, then the pollutant that comes into that water body stays there. And it keeps your downstream navigable water cleaner. So in this case, the connectivity matters to protect the quality of your navigable waters, even if you argue that that's your only goal. So what we did in this work is we used remotely sensed wetland inundation data along with some simple models to show that when you have smaller wetlands in the landscape that are disconnected, they have water for maybe a third of the year, they actually remove proportionately more nutrients than the connected water bodies because the nitrogen and phosphorus that gets there stays there. Right. So as I said, because of lack of time, so this is remotely sensed data. This is a small wetland, 30 years of Landsat data. And this is a large wetland that has water and is connected throughout the year. So in this case, I know this group is thinking a lot about connectivity. This case, the idea is that disconnected wetland I'm not going to go into a lot of details, actually has proportionally more nitrogen retention than a connected smaller wetland in the system. So I'm going to jump through to the last point. So kind of summing that, small wetlands are important. Distribution matters, right? So I talk a lot about small, but it's not just small, it's the distribution of wetland sizes. Different sizes are valuable for different functions. So yes, the smaller ones might be doing more nitrogen retention, a medium. So when I talk to Ducks Canada, for example, they would say, we preserve one particular size because duck hunting happens at that size. So every size matters. Location matters. So the scene is not necessarily better. Right, and you have the sense of saying, I've had so many people say, well, you know, these wetlands are polluted, so it's okay to be broken. But because they are polluted, they are in our landscape, they are protecting our waters where we need it most. And then the last piece is connectivity matters, but connected wetlands are not necessarily that. So all of this, and this is my last slide, we are embarking on a large Canadian project, where one of the questions we are asking is where to restore the wetlands. And we are asking this question not just from a water quality perspective, but also from a carbon sequestration perspective, and hopefully a little bit also from the biodiversity perspective. So looking at these multiple perspectives and coming up with these wetland blueprints of restoration.
So I can see that we have time for a few questions.
Thanks for your talk. I was thinking about the, your comment about 90% of those wetlands, I think disappeared, and that Maduro's comment about, well, the same for a forest. So we're talking about wetlands being restored as a tool you drop on the agricultural land to fix some problem. But I guess in forest, they would try to do the same thing. There's restoration of forest. Is there any knowledge about the interaction, so the coupling between forest ecosystems and wetlands, that there's synergy? Because from your talk, I could think that, well, you don't want them to be close to the forest because the forest is the problem. The wetland is going to fix the problem in the agricultural land, so you want to restore them where the problem is. But historically, the problem been interacting, exchanging material.
Yes, and you would want both. I mean, there are interactions. I mean, parallel to the wetland restoration or cornfield, you would say, well, there's urban forestry and there is forestry within agricultural areas. So again, I mean, I'm not saying that do not restore wetlands in more pristine areas. I think different regions of restoration have different functions associated with it, other connection has. In this case, in kind of this water purification, it's more thinking about it from I would say this is where a little bit of my engineering hat comes into play. It's we need to remove these pollutants from the system, and an efficient way of doing it is by restoring the plants. This can be difficult.
With your example of the difference between the targeted restoration of wetlands versus random or avoiding agricultural land, was the targeted restoration taking into account this result that you mentioned, that the smaller wetlands are picking up much more of the nitrogen, because if you targeted to restore the small wetlands by your argument, but your result, that would be much more effective, right?
Yes,
So
yeah.
is that what the model did, or?
It has in it, but what we did was in this case, we wanted to fix one because we wanted to explore the different dimensions. In this case, we fixed the wetland size to the smaller range of sizes, and we explored just the targeting. Part of the reason was, if you're thinking about wetland restoration, again, you're not talking about an active land use change. So the smaller wetland restoration means that agriculture will still continue the way it is. So I think we had a certain range of wetland sizes. We didn't allow it to vary across that entire.
You already took into account that result, that the smaller ones should have priority, at least for nitrogen.
Exactly. And in another project we are working on, we're kind of exploring also I've not talked about it, the morphology of the wetlands, the wetland size and its catchment to wetland area ratio, and thinking about that. So all of these are different dimensions, kind of in this case one of the fixed one.
So thanks for your talk, by the way, that was very fascinating. So you've shown lots of data, which is wonderful in that you can see how things are changing through time, which is great. You can also make predictions about what the trends are. But in terms of, I guess, when you do something to change any ecosystem, there's always going to be other things that are going to happen as a consequence, which we can't always predict. And I was wondering whether people use models to try to predict the impact of maybe changing something here in terms of how it might affect the whole system.
There's been a little work that I know about that in the wetland space about this idea. So I mentioned if I'm understanding the question right, in terms of as your wetlands have been further required, so that people have done kind of the population circle models to see how that impacts that. Yes.
Have you had any experience with using beavers to restore wetlands? And then, yeah.
No, so I know of that body of work, and I would say, so a lot of the wetland work that I described is more upland wetlands. So the beaver part of it is more about the marine wetlands, and there's been quite a bit of work in that space, but yeah. I think
How are you measuring that?
So in this case, the meta-analysis is people that have done studies where they have measured flow and concentration at the inlet to the wetlands and flow and concentration at the outlets to the wetland, and we just take that number to say what is the effective nitrogen removal rate.
What's the main contributor of nitrogen?
Two things in a wetland. One is uptake by wetland vegetation, and the second is denitrification. You could argue that because if you kind of assume that there's uptake by vegetation, but there's also mineralization of that pool, that is kind of in a pseudo steady state, so the net removal would always be just denitrification. And that's the assumption we made in that work because all we had was data at much annual time scale. If you get finer time scale data, you can decouple those factors.
Was there any worry that nitrous oxide emissions?
Very good question. Yes. So part of this solutions-scape project is kind of in this mode of thinking about these trade-offs, right? So there's questions about nitrous oxide emissions from wetlands and nitrous oxide as a greenhouse gas. There's also questions about methane emissions from wetlands. And there's also really interesting work about how size of wetlands drives these emissions. So in this project, we are going to look into those controls to say, well, where are those trade-offs? There's interesting biochemistry there, where as salinity levels of wetlands change, something is suppressed, something is increased. But there's always that question. Whenever you're reducing nitrate from the water, you have a potential of N2O.
You mentioned, so with nutrient, you said removal, so nutrient uptake in the wetlands. You focused on nitrogen, but you also mentioned phosphorus there. Is the profile for phosphorus similar or?
So yeah, to be just, I haven't presented that. We have this ongoing publishing out of stats. So we are looking at it for phosphorus in the Lake Erie Basin. It's similar and it's different. The different thing about phosphorus is that nitrogen can be removed to the atmosphere as nitrogen gas or N2O. Phosphorus, as when it gets into the wetland, there's no way for it to leak because it's unsafe, right? So it stays there in the sediment. The challenge that happens with wetlands, with some of it, which is the big question with phosphorus, is that they can potentially become sources at some point in time because if there's a lot of phosphorus, then some rain events can release that phosphorus and your outflow can become more than inflow. So in this work we're doing with phosphorus, we focus just on that question, like when does that happen? Because while we were storing a lot of wetlands, we didn't want that to be phosphorus source. But generally, the small aspect of it, the small ones do there is similar for phosphorus and nitrogen, but again, that has to do with the sanitary.
Well, I have a question. Then, we are most people and these. So I was thinking of all your interaction with people in health and doing something for to restoration of wetlands.
No, and that's a really important point, an interesting point that needs to be thought about, right? So there is this nuisance factor of wetlands, for mosquitoes. And again, this depends on where you're staying, right? It's a way bigger concern in the parts of India that I'm from, right? If you have malaria, so that's a different story. And I think there's really interesting work on how also the size and the connectivity minimizes some of that. And that I'm not an expert on, but there's work. I would say for these landscapes, right, it's more of a nuisance than anything else. What I found is in my conversations with people around is what a lot of times people don't recognize is that sticky pond with mosquitoes is actually protecting them so they can go enjoy the beach and not have an outbreak in the beach. So I think that connection is important for people to recognize, and I don't think it's there yet. We don't value it in a way. So yes, it has negatives, but it's like you're drinking water filtered. That is the benefit of it. So I think the nuisance factor of it, I think people would be more open to it if the connection was visible, and right now the connection I don't think is visible.
Well, that's all the time we have, unfortunately, now. But I do want to thank Nandita for this very interesting talk, and also that memorable note that you ended on with comparing and contrast, right? The stinky nuisance pond to, helping you have, a clean beach that you can enjoy later. And so again, thank you for showing us those connections, as well as telling us about mathematics that all kinds of people know and can relate to, and all the insights that we get from that.
Thank you so much. This is lovely.
And then we have a thank you. So we do have a half-hour break, and so please do get refreshments. Check out the Post-it notes. Catch Nandita before you have to run. I told there I will say now. Okay, great. And then we'll see you in 30 minutes.
So it's 20 minutes. 40. Okay, sorry. So 40 starting to talk.